In the early 1700s, a man by the name of Edward Teach would join the crew of a renowned pirate captain named Benjamin Hornigold. The two began to work together out of New Providence, a hotspot and safe haven for pirates at the time. And after enough trust had been built, Why has his name gotta be that? Anyways, he was like, yo, Eddie, what if you took control of one of my ships? And Edward was like, yeah, sure, dude, I can do that. And so they each started captaining their own ships with their own crews, rampaging through the American Atlantic coast and its many islands, stealing wine, and then maybe some occasional flour. Before eventually, a year later, around 1717, Teach would take control of a French merchant boat called the Concorde, and Edward was not really fucking with that name. He'd heard terrible things about the game, and so he renamed it to the now iconic Queen Anne's Revenge. With this new ship and larger crew, Teach began to sail the seven seas, but mainly stayed near the coast of the 13 original colonies, terrorizing the trade routes specifically of North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and especially Virginia, eventually earning the name of Blackbeard for his ominous appearance and his very large black beard. But like all fame, it eventually bites you in the ass, as he would eventually piss off the governor of Virginia a bit too much, resulting in a large force of pirate hunters sent after Blackbeard and his crew, and after a long battle, Teach and his crew would dominate the other vessels, eventually boarding one of the ships before being caught off guard by a surprise attack from beneath the deck, where he would get shot probably more than enough times before eventually just getting his head cut schmoove off, marking the end of the infamous Blackbeard. So although the man had died, the legacy of the pirate would live on. And likely not in any way Blackbeard would have expected, because as the years passed, a new platform for piracy had popped up and was stealing more money and just more things in general in ways pirates could not imagine. No boat required. Instead being done through an interconnected network of machines talking to each other in a rudimentary language through a series of protocols and instructions, also known as the internet. But, maybe we're getting a bit too ahead of ourselves, as even before the internet, piracy would begin in a variety of forms, such as through the copying of VHS tapes for movies and or cassettes for music. VHS copying and cassette copying were actually fairly similar, as both involved having two devices to play them, so two VCRs or two cassette players, and a blank VHS or cassette tape. From here, after you had the proper cables to connect the two devices, you simply clicked record on one of the VCRs or cassette players and play on the other, and voila, you had pirated a movie, show, or piece of music. Software piracy would be the earliest glimpse into piracy as we would know it today, primarily because it involved the most popular modern device for piracy, a computer. Now, although the internet would be in its infancy at the time, we'd see piracy similarly emerge like with the VHS and cassette tape, at the start of the home computer era in the late 70s and early 80s, as smaller, more manageable computers were sold to everyday consumers looking to utilize them for a variety of technical needs that would only grow over time as their overall functionality expanded. And like we've already seen with VHS and cassette tapes, well, I'm sure you know where this is going. As remarkable as this bit of technology was, if you had another empty floppy disk, there wasn't much to stop a person from simply copying that software onto their computer's hard drive and then copying it back onto another empty floppy disk. Now, sellers of music, movies, and software all had a similar problem, because if copies of the original sold versions could simply be given away by anyone who owned the original software and had an extra VHS tape, cassette, or floppy disk lying around, how the hell was a company supposed to sell their product, let alone get the funds to pay people to make more of it going forward? It was clearly a problem that probably needed to be fixed, and it felt as if it uniquely affected software companies, as selling their software directly to consumers was really the only way they could make a profit. They didn't have theatrical film releases or concerts they could rely on. So if companies planned to make software profitable, they needed to do something. So very early on, developers began to use various methods to prevent or restrict copying software from one floppy disk to another. Some of these included simply inhibiting the copying of a disk by manipulating the disk's format or sectors, which meant including data between a floppy disk sectors so that copying would result in missing data if you copied it sector by sector, which was done typically in earlier machines. Now, this method and others like it were surprisingly easy to crack, so new methods would eventually be formed in what would become a constant battle to innovate on the prevention of copying of software to floppy disks. A similar battle would occur with VHS tapes, with one of the earliest methods being Macrovision's analog protection system, which would essentially exploit the system of automatic gain control present in a VCR, but not in TVs, to make it so that the VHS would normally play on a TV perfectly fine, but when it was recorded over to a VCR, would make it extremely dim, as well as mess with the vertical blank interval, resulting in this, which, as you can imagine, is tough to watch. That being said, the system wasn't perfect, as it would still occasionally have the same effect on legitimate VHS tapes of a movie or show, so not a perfect system by any means. As for cassettes, well, they never really figured out something for that. But these protections would lead to an interesting debate. Did you really own your software, a movie, or whatever you bought if you weren't allowed to use it and alter it how you wanted to? For a piece of software, if you bought and paid for it, why shouldn't you be allowed to alter the code how you please, even if that means circumventing anti-piracy protections? Well, this would, and still continues to be, a point of debate, but widely speaking, things did not go in favor of those looking to pass these protections or make copies of copyrighted material. One of the earliest pieces of legislation in the United States to target this was the Copyright Act of 1976, which granted copyright holders exclusive rights to control the reproduction, distribution, and other uses of their work, with this later being amended with the Computer Software Copyright Act of 1980 to include software. Outside of just the US, laws existed in the UK many years prior for types of copyright infringement, such as one of the original laws from 1710, that being the Statute of Anne, which aimed to protect authors from unauthorized reproduction of their books for a specific period of time after their publication. Now, although these laws did exist to deter pirating, unless it was being done at a mass scale, it was usually fairly difficult to really enforce these, so many people simply continued to do it anyways, a philosophy still widely held today. And for a while, pirating would stay fairly relegated to a physical medium, usually just bros and dudes trading around VHS copies of Smokey and the Bandit and/or cassettes of the newest Willie Nelson single. But even without the widespread adoption of the internet, computer users were able to communicate with each other and pirate things through computer bulletin board systems, one of the earliest forms of online blogs and messaging boards. Through these bulletin board systems, users could communicate with each other, or even play games with each other. But most importantly for this video, these bulletin board systems allowed for users to share files and software with each other fairly easily, in what could be viewed as one of the earliest forms of long-distance internet, but not actually internet, piracy. In the mid-80s, CDs would also gain some popularity, only initially being used as a medium for audio, and for the time being were a lot more difficult to directly copy to another CD, but you were still able to just relatively easily copy the audio from a CD to a cassette using a similar method as cassette-to-cassette copying. Then only a few years later, CD-ROMs were released, allowing software to be stored and sold on a CD, which would begin the slow downfall of the floppy disk as a storage device, but they were still fairly widely used even up into the 90s, helping to give birth to the anti-piracy song that would sweep nations, "Don't Copy That Floppy."
I thought you knew better, don't copy that floppy.
CD-ROMs would later on feature some copy protections, but similar to the initial CDs used for audio, it was very difficult to copy directly to another CD, at least at the time. So little attention was put into these sorts of copy protections on a general basis, with some copy protection methods involving complex solutions within the software, but one of the most simple, but more than anything annoying methods, was requiring the users to have a manual. This method would ask users upon first launching a program to look inside of their manual for a specific word or phrase on a page within the manual to ensure that the user actually owned a copy of the software. But this was honestly something not too tough to crack most of the time, and again, was just really annoying for whoever actually owned the software. As we began to head into the 90s, things were changing fast, and 1993 is where we would see the emergence of the largest pirating facilitator in the world, the World Wide Web, aka the Internet. Now, the internet would be the birth of a lot of things, arguably too many things, but one thing it has remained consistently good at is allowing a platform for individuals to trade legally distributed versions of almost anything. Whether it was software, music, movies, or TV shows, on the internet, you could get it. Many of the early websites used for this, sometimes referred to as where sites, are seemingly lost to time, but some softwares did exist to take advantage of tech similar to bulletin board systems, but the most notable chat messaging app in the late 90s would be AOL Instant Messenger. AOL Instant Messenger would be released in 1997 by AOL. Big surprise there, and would pretty quickly become the largest messaging platform in North America, peaking at over 33 million users a few years later in 2001. AOL primarily held a teenage and young adult audience, and although it mainly served its intended purpose of just being a messenger app where people would talk to each other and their friends, they did have a file sharing service, which as you can imagine allowed users to pretty easily send copies of either a song or maybe a piece of software if it was small enough. But since the internet was so slow back then, it was a bit harder to pirate anything more than that. As the internet would become more popular and as we inched closer to Y2K, not even AOL would compare to the largest peer-to-peer file sharing site that the world had ever seen, Napster. Now, if you were alive back then, you knew about Napster, and hell, I wasn't, and even I knew about it. This shit was huge. Founded by two guys named Sean, different spellings though, in case you might get confused, Napster would launch in 1999 as a software service focused on sharing music. Although I glossed over it a bit when talking about AOL, the .mp3 file format was pretty revolutionary at the time, serving as an audio file format that allowed for a very small file that kept good audio quality. And due to this, the sharing of music online became a whole lot easier. And it would be this file type that would enable not only a whole lot of technology, technology that we would see in the following years, such as a wave of MP3 players on the early 2000s, but more importantly for the story, it would be leveraged by Napster to create an entire software platform that allowed users to download music shared with each other. The peer-to-peer system that Napster was designed on would be pivotal for its success, as a large database of music it had available on its platform wouldn't need any centralized server, as users would essentially be downloading these copies of music directly from each other. Peer-to-peer file transferring would also later become known as torrenting, which if you're familiar with this stuff at all, you'll know that this would serve as the foundation for pretty much every pirating service going forward. Napster would see a huge amount of success in its first year, but not before immediately getting hit with lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. You see, not only did wrongful distribution of this music break copyright laws, but many artists would hear about their songs on Napster and directly sue the Shans. One of the earliest cases would be brought against Napster by a small band you might have heard of called Metallica. The band had been working on a new song called I Disappear and were set to release it in a few weeks when they heard through the grapevine that an early version of the song was actually already entirely available through Napster. From here, the news would spread like wildfire, as artists like Dr. Dre and Madonna would all file lawsuits against Napster, with major organizations such as A&M Records also filing major lawsuits against what were essentially two teenagers who had gotten a bit over their heads. Now, although many arguments were made at the time that Napster was taking away money from artists, which it was, but there were also some cases to show that Napster was actually really good at exposing new songs and artists to drive up their numbers. Although Radiohead was already very well known at the time, their upcoming album Kid A, which had leaked a few months prior on Napster, would increase the hype of the album, pushing it at the top of the Billboard upon its release. And although this is one of the major cases of Napster benefiting the music industry, it's really tough to measure exactly how many artists and their songs were exposed to new audiences because of the ease of access to new music that Napster provided. That being said, this would all be far too much for Napster to handle, resulting in it forcefully shutting down in 2001 and filing bankruptcy a year later before eventually relaunching as a subscription service, similar to modern streaming platforms, while also having the option to flat out buy songs on the platform. Although Napster was out of the piracy game, music enjoyers all around the world had gotten a taste of what it was like to listen to any song you want, whenever you wanted, all for free, and so although the platform was gone, the demand was not. And a whole handful of other platforms would rise up to the occasion to fill the hole that Napster had left behind. In 2001, BitTorrent would be released, first as a file transfer protocol, and then later on as a client program that could use protocols established by its creator, Bram Cohen. BitTorrent would pave the way for torrents even as we know them today, and although the BitTorrent software itself would be challenged by many other variations, at the end of the day, the protocol or tech behind how it functioned is still used today as the main driving force for a lot of peer-to-peer file transferring that goes on in the world. So not only were we able to now pirate music, but software started being flung around this time as well. Looking at pure replacements of Napster, LimeWire and Kazaa are both pretty well-known music-based platforms that function similar to Napster, but would also become just as well-known for being bundled with spyware. And this of course completely ignores all the other files that were shared on these platforms that had a pretty decent chance of containing viruses. And that was one of the major issues with pirating at the time, despite all the ethical questions that surrounded piracy, because I mean, you wouldn't steal a car, would you? There also was the major problem of pirating having a decent chance at just blowing up your computer and making it entirely unusable. Viruses have been and continue to be a consistent risk when pirating anything. Although things nowadays generally feel a bit safer thanks to very solid built-in antivirus protection in the main operating systems out there, back in the day, things were incredibly risky. When downloading from these torrenting clients, not only did some of them already have built-in spyware like the early versions of LimeWire, but many of these torrents featured a variety of different types of things that would range from making your computer entirely unusable or just stealing your personal information. Many torrent sites would spring up during this time period due to the influx of users torrenting, with one of the largest being the Pirates Bay. Founded in 2003, the Pirates Bay continues to be one of the largest torrenting sites on the internet. Although Pirates Bay and sites like it were just overall good places to discover torrents, these sites also had the added benefit of having certain verification systems or safety indicators to highlight trustworthy users or just overall verify that the cracked software you were downloading was actually malware-free. Because of the overall popularity of Pirates Bay and similar torrenting sites, this attracted a pretty large amount of attention, particularly of the legal kind. One of the most famous of these cases involved Pirates Bay in 2009, which saw the site shut down for multiple days after Swedish police arrested the site's founders and raided multiple facilities and servers. With the case being considered so important that for the first time in the country's history, the trial was broadcasted live for Swedish citizens to view. This would culminate into a final verdict of the 4 men being charged with being accessories to a crime breaking copyright law, with a year in prison attached to a fat multi-million-dollar fine, which they would of course all appeal. 2 of the 4 founders were not really about that life though. So Gottfried Svartholm and Fredrik Nij would successfully get the hell out of there for a few years, but would both eventually be arrested and sent back to Sweden to serve their time in jail. Despite all of this though, the site remains up, usually existing through proxy sites, with its operations being upheld by community support and largely because of multiple backup servers across multiple countries. With piracy much more accessible, many PSAs would air regarding the dangers of piracy, such as the previously mentioned 2004 classic, "You wouldn't steal a car, would you?" And to be fair, these companies, organizations, and artists had a bit of a right to be pissed. You know, in 2005, it was estimated that from the US film industry alone, $6.2 billion were lost because of piracy. And again, that's just like a singular industry in the United States. But outside of what just felt like really useless PSAs, companies started to try and up the ante when it came to copyright protection. For example, in 2005, we'd see the introduction of the Extended Copy Protection, or XCP system. No, not that shit. This system was a form of DRM that would be used on CDs pushed out by Sony at the time, which was fairly notorious as it functioned as a rootkit, concealing itself in a computer so that it was almost impossible to remove, while simultaneously slowing down a computer's performance and causing overall security vulnerabilities. So Sony actually had to attempt to remove all this from people's systems, which turned out to be very difficult, and then recall the CDs that were sent out with this technology. And the worst part is that the DRM could very easily be bypassed, so it wasn't even effective at stopping the copying of their CDs. This tech and others like it would show a general trend, though, of these companies using more invasive methods to try to crack down on piracy. Despite all the protections that would attempt to be implemented over the following years, the numbers continue to rise with further traffic to file sharing sites, and in particular, illegal streaming service sites, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Not me, though, but supposedly they exist out there. And I mean, starting in the 2010s, we would see some great advancements in making material that were often pirated a lot more accessible. iTunes would pop up and mimic Napster's monetization model after they had that whole lawsuit that required them to pay back a bunch of money, but it allowed users to digitally and easily be able to buy individual songs and albums. And although I feel like iTunes is more associated with music, they had TV shows and movies out there too. And speaking of TV shows and movies, the 2010s would see the rise of streaming services, which would make it so you could easily watch pretty much everything on like Netflix. Because I mean, driving to Blockbuster was honestly just too difficult. Hell, even with video games, PlayStation and Xbox started to have their own digital storefronts because, as it turns out, GameStop was also just too difficult to drive to. Which, to be fair, guys, I might be 14, but please just let me buy GTA 5. You do not need to have to try to convince my mom that I should not be allowed to buy it. It was already hard enough to get her to convince her to buy a $60 game to begin with. Just please, just stop. That being said, all of these things were monumental in getting stuff in the hands of consumers, which I think is definitely a good thing, even if it does mean that a significant amount of the millennial population now does have a nostalgic hole in their heart for midnight game releases and blockbuster movie nights with their parents. With subscription services like Apple Music or Spotify, or even just playing stuff through YouTube, traditional music piracy isn't really a thing we do anymore. The barrier of entry is made so low and easily affordable that there wasn't really a need to jump through the traditional hoops and risk your computer being infected by the worst shit known to man. Funny enough, we've actually seen the opposite happen in the film, software, and video game industry. Although streaming services were once seen as a convenience, they've turned into a massive headache in a certain way, leading to an increase in overall piracy rates and illegal streaming service sites visited. Because everyone and their mom needs to make a streaming service, this has led to a large fragmentation in available popular media, meaning that a lot of the streaming services have been flooded with low-quality garbage just to fill out their catalogs. And so if you were wanting to access all of this media, I mean, let's just run some numbers. Just in case I really feel like mixing up what I'm watching every night, what if I just had all the streaming services? Well, I have to have my Netflix subscription, so that's $7.99. And actually, that's with ads now, right? Because that's why people left cable, so naturally, we just want to run that back again. Good idea. Alright, so $17.99 a month if we actually want to get the old ad-free service that was just $7.99 a few years ago. Perfect. And then we've got to get Hulu. Gotta love Hulu. And, that's $10 with ads. And $19 for no ads. Okay, we're just gonna have to suck it up and take the ad-free versions going forward then to make sure our monthly budget stays intact. So, 8 plus 10, $18 a month so far with ads. Great. Awesome. And then, gotta have Amazon Prime Video, and I mean, that's $9 with ads, but it's only $15 if you get Amazon Prime as well, so might as well get that. That'll bring us to $33 a month. Disney Plus, $10 with ads. Apple TV Plus, $10, but at least no ads there. Paramount Plus, $8 with ads. HBO Max, fuck you, I'm still calling it HBO Max, $10 with ads. Peacock, I thought that shit was free. Guess not. $8 with ads. ESPN Plus, $12 with ads. YouTube TV, $83 fucking a month with ads. Fubo, $20 a month. What the fuck is Fubo? Alright, so adding that all up, we're up to $194 a month, and maybe a bit left over for groceries. But let's say maybe we just cut YouTube TV to make sure things aren't as skewed, and $111 a month. Welcome back, cable TV. So yeah, I think there might be a reason piracy is on the rise for movies and TV shows, but what about software? Well, after observing the success of streaming services and in an effort to avoid piracy, companies like Adobe have switched to You're never gonna guess it, a subscription service model that will similarly bleed you dry over time instead of just being able to, buy and own it outright. Who would want to do that? So yeah, piracy is still very popular there, even if it is a bit harder to pirate since they have their account-based systems to now ensure you need to have an active subscription to something like, I don't know, Microsoft 365 or Photoshop. But even then, it hasn't really entirely stopped some people from getting around these inconveniences or simply just sticking to older versions. Video game piracy is pretty prevalent as well, with numbers seemingly being on the rise due to a variety of factors. Now, because of this increased rate of piracy in the gaming community, a whole lot of game companies implement this very intensive DRM or digital rights management software within their games in an effort to deter piracy, which funnily enough usually only takes like a few months to get around, and due to the complexity of the programs within these games, usually leads to them having their performance significantly impacted for the worst, which in a roundabout way leads to a lot of people who've even bought the original game pirating it in some cases because the pirated version runs so much better without the DRM. So you could say that's a bit ironic. When it comes to strictly multiplayer games, it's nearly impossible to pirate these from my understanding, at least if you want to actively play against real players, because you're going to be connecting to their servers and you need to have like the actual license. And anyways, but single player games are where cracked versions seemingly pop up left and right. And when it comes to single player games, a whole lot of older games were single player due to, obvious technical limitations at the time, but many of these games, for one reason or another, were kind of forgotten about by the creators and or publishers, making it so a lot of these games are almost impossible or very difficult to find and play legally, resulting in a large community developing online for emulation of these older games, with an emulation equivalent available now, it feels like, for almost any older console. And I mean, in my mind, if I want to go play Simpsons Hit and Run, I shouldn't need to go find an old PS2 and a copy of the game floating around out there on the secondary market where none of the money is going to Sony or the developers just to be able to play it. But a lot of companies don't particularly see it that way. With this in mind though, emulation and piracy in general doesn't really always come in the easier to justify form of stealing. A whole lot of emulated and cracked games are newer titles that people just don't really feel like paying for. And I mean, with the rising cost of games, we just saw the Switch 2 prices. Jesus. I get it. In gaming alone, this has of course been met with a whole lot of legal issues over the years, with a major story in particular popping up last year surrounding Nintendo's shutdown of the Nintendo Switch emulators like Yuzu, which sparked a discussion on whether or not emulators are inherently breaking copyright laws. But that's the thing though, even with certain emulators or pirating sites shutting down, no matter how many arrests get made in these large, high-profile cases, piracy is probably just gonna keep happening. Although there does exist the moral dilemma of piracy being theft, for the average person out there, I just don't think this moral challenge is a strong enough deterrent. There's no punishment really for an individual pirating things, it's free, and I mean, when it's difficult just to access the material legally, like in the cases of older games, or just with the fragmentation of streaming services, it's a no-brainer people are just gonna decide to download Cube, BitTorrent, or just hit up 123 Movies. And I mean, some of you have got to know I was going to reference this, but Gabe Newell, creator of Valve and therefore the largest PC gaming market, Steam, once famously said, "Piracy is almost always a service problem, not a pricing problem." And when essentially looking at the eradication of music piracy due to the ease of access music streaming services provided, it's hard to disagree with that. But that being said, I think it's an equal mix of both. In the event that a price is either too high for somebody or the product is too annoying or difficult to obtain, people are just going to turn to piracy. Modern-day piracy ain't like it used to be. You can't just send the Navy at the pirates. They're not working with boats anymore. It's a large, decentralized group of people all over the world who maintain this ecosystem on the internet. And although it feels like people can slow them down, I don't really think they'll ever stop them. That being said, due to the rising rate of piracy, I think it's worth pushing these entertainment-focused industries to question not just how you can stop people from pirating games, but make them want to buy what they're selling. Thank you all for watching this month's video. I hope you enjoyed. Now, part of this was just a reason to bitch about streaming services and just the overall state of pricing in the video game industry, because you know me. But maybe those will get their own videos too. Who knows? Either way, I hope I maybe taught you something new, something fun, and of course, got to give a special thanks to this month's patrons: Mads, Dave the Unknown, Griff, Einhar Anderson, Turmeric, Maddie Graddy, Kenny, Daddy Yam, Bup1, and Oliver. Thank you all so much. You make this worth doing. And of course, thanks to everyone else for watching. It really does mean a lot. That being said, I gotta get out of here. I'm probably gonna be spending a lot of time editing this one. But I hope you enjoyed. And until next time, take care.